Victorian Government Office for Women in Sport and Recreation, the Director, Bridie O'Donnell, a medical doctor, tweeted her support for the Black Lives Matter protest over the weekend, despite advice from the Premier and Chief Health Officer telling people to stay away. This is the tweet. Today, there are powerful, peaceful protests across Australia that shouted to the world that Aboriginal lives matter. The images are inspiring and sobering. I'm relieved that thousands attended, that none were arrested, and that many more made the decision not to attend, but will hashtag pay the rent. Well, the Pay the Rent campaign calls on Victorians to commit 1% of their income to a fund for Indigenous Victorians, but the fund's not a registered charity. It's time for tonight's panel. Melbourne City Councillor Nicholas Rees and Sky News Outsiders co-host and Herald Sun columnist Rita Panahi both join me now from Melbourne. I'll start there first with the Victorian Deputy Chief Health Officer Annalise Van Diemen. This is those tweets about Captain Cook a little while ago. Now the head of the Victorian Government Department office there, Rita, over the weekend supporting these protests. Surely taxpayers can expect these public servants just to do what we pay them to do and leave the politics behind.
Well, obviously not. Some of these public servants make it pretty clear that they can only work with one side of politics, their own personal politics being such that they're borderline activists. At least this particular official isn't a public health official, but we have seen examples of public health officials elsewhere, not in Victoria, advocating for these protests at the same time as they're advocating for tight lockdowns. So they've completely undermined the public's faith in them. And in Victoria, I've got to say, Dan Andrews may have said don't go to the protests, but he ensured there was a bumper crowd there because earlier in the week they announced they weren't going to be fining anybody. So if you wanted people not to show up, then you enforce the law and you fine people, and that's how you reduce the numbers. When you tell them it's a free-for-all, then of course the crowd is going to be far bigger than it otherwise would be.
Nick, you've worked in federal politics for some time. I don't understand why there is things allowed in Victorian state politics that would never be allowed by senior government officials in the federal sphere. Political staff is one thing, but not public paid officials under the different Act, the Public Service Act. And surely if they've got such political views, you know, good luck to them, but you run for office, you don't do it from a taxpayer-funded platform.
Look, I think that it's actually okay for public servants to have a political background or have been involved in politics at some point in their lives. I mean, it is a democracy. People are free to be involved in political issues. I guess where it becomes problematic is when their political views do start affecting their job. So for example, you know, Scott Morrison's former Chief of Staff is now the head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, effectively the most senior public servant in the country. I think that's okay, as long as he applies himself with an even hand and gives frank and fearless advice on the issues that he's dealing with. I guess what this has revealed more than anything is this vexed area of when you do work for government or for any organisation and you express a view on an issue in your private time on a private platform like Twitter or any one of these other social media platforms, whether you can then be called to account for that in your working life. Because that's what happened to this woman. She put something up on Twitter. She made the comments you cited. She also said she was proud to see her nieces marching in the Brisbane rallies. And now she's professionally, in her working life, being held to account for that. I think that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, well, I think there's a certain level, though you are in a public service role, there is no private Twitter. It's akin to putting out a press release. She wouldn't have put out a press release holding these views, but she thinks it's okay to go out on Twitter. And I just think there's more and more of this, and it's not good enough. It's not good enough for taxpayers. Rita, I want to go into this issue of universities too. Big report out today. New South Wales Auditor General looked at the salaries of vice-chancellors. So for people who don't know, the chancellor is sort of like the president of the university, and the vice-chancellor is like a CEO, basically runs a university. Well, you know, modelling says there's going to be losses in the university sector somewhere between $3.1 billion and $4.8 billion coming out of this pandemic. But some of these chancellors earn well over $1 million a year. Are they overpaid, Rita?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the highest paid one in Sydney, 1.6 million, Melbourne, 1.5 million. I just don't know how you could justify a vice chancellor getting a salary that's 3 times that of the prime minister. And you look at the state of our universities, you look at the lack of critical thinking, the lack of free speech on campus, and their absolute over reliance on overseas students, particularly from China. And you really wonder why they're getting these enormous salaries, exactly what are they achieving so well to justify those enormous rewards.
Nick, it's a fair point. If you look at the world rankings, I think we've only got one university inside the top 50, yet the salaries of our vice-chancellors are 3 times what they're being paid, even with the exchange rate in Britain. How is that justified?
Look, Australian Vice-Chancellors are well paid. It should be noted that in these tough times, a lot of them have taken pay cuts. Certainly in Victoria, most of the Vice-Chancellors have taken pay cuts of around 25%. But you shouldn't forget, Peter, that Australian universities are very large by international standards. In fact, they're huge, and they're very complex organisations. And there's a lot riding on the good performance of these VCs. I mean, you're right, they're copping a financial hit at the moment of around $5 billion a year. Look, even if all the vice-chancellors cut their salaries to zero tomorrow, that's not going to take much of a dent out of the $5 billion hit that they're suffering at the moment. So, look, they are well paid, but they are running huge institutions which have become a hugely important part of the national economy as well.
Well, look, if they weren't paid by the taxpayer in any way, universities, the whole sector, I'd have no issue with what they pay. They pay on performance, that's fine. But when the taxpayer's involved, I don't know that I can support it.